I'm Paige Henry, the owner of Regal Financial. We proudly support the YWCA Dayton's Voices Against Violence because we know the YW plays a pivotal role in our community. The session you're about to watch focuses on immigration. Immigrant women suffer higher rates of abuse than women born in the U.S. Additionally, abusers often use immigration status as a tool to exert control over their partner. YWCA Dayton works with a variety of organizations, including Catholic Social Services and Welcome Dayton, contracts with translation services to make sure that immigrants who are facing abuse have all the tools they need to find safety. Please join me making a gift to ensure this critical work continues by going to ywcadayton.org/donate.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome back. Hopefully everybody got some time to get maybe some breakfast or coffee. My name is Lindsay Bohan, and I'm the shelter manager here at YWCA Dayton. Survivors of domestic violence come through our shelter from all walks of life. It is not uncommon that we have a survivor come through our doors who is new to the country, who doesn't speak English, and who needs the support of our services. Through partnerships with organizations like Catholic Social Services and Welcome Dayton, as well as contracts with language translation services, anyone who walks into our building or calls our hotline is treated with peace, justice, and dignity. This morning, I have the privilege to introduce our speaker joining us to discuss the intersections of domestic violence and immigration. But before I do that, I want to thank our sponsors. First off, we have a thank you to Regal Financial, who is our sponsor for the entire event, for returning actually as a presenting sponsor for the second year. Secondly, I want to thank this session sponsor, Larson Lyons and Al Hamdani, for supporting our immigration session, which we're currently on. We have Nikki Lyons here to say a few words about their work.
Let me unmute myself here. First of all, I want to say thank you for inviting us to be a part of this important event, even if it has to be virtual this year, but thank you. So at Larson Lyons and Al Hamdani, we dedicate 100% of our practice to immigration and serving the immigrant community. We help businesses hire and mobilize their global talent, families identify immigration services, represent foreign nationals faced with possibility of deportation, as well as help identify humanitarian protections to those most vulnerable foreign nationals. In particular, I further specialize, it's like a subspecialty, in working with survivors, whether it's foreign nationals who are a survivor of human trafficking, domestic violence, or have been a victim of a qualifying crime. And oftentimes my clients do not self-identify as victims due to the cultural normalization of domestic violence, or the cultural perception that men cannot also be victims. Again, thank you. We're dedicated to being a voice against violence and proud to stand with you guys today.
Thank you, Nikki. And also, again, thank you to Regal Financial, as well as Larson Lyons and Al Hamdani. Now to introduce our speaker. So Daniel Fiersick currently serves as the manager of non-residential domestic violence services at the YWCA Greater Cincinnati, where she leads the Immigrant Survivors of Partner Violence Coalition and the coordinated response to domestic violence, human trafficking, sexual assault, and stalking cases via the YWCA Family Justice Center. In her work at the FJC, Danielle leads a team consisting of advocates, lawyers, a domestic violence investigator, domestic violence prosecutor, probation officer, and an immigration liaison officer in order to facilitate a client-centered approach to survivors of violence. Danielle has worked in the human rights field for over a decade with a focus on the intersections of gender, race, and sexuality. Danielle has a dual BA in international relations and diplomacy and Middle East studies from The Ohio State University, and an MA in human rights from Columbia University. Without further ado, Daniel Fiersick.
The past 8 months or so have been a wild ride for service providers, for people that are suffering intimate partner violence. It's kind of been what I consider a perfect storm of factors that lead to increased violence both within and without people's homes and communities. COVID-19, leaving a lot of survivors co-quarantined with their abuser, which is incredibly dangerous for obvious reasons. For the first couple months, I know that we were having different issues with people being able to even report that they were experiencing violence. We had to shift to adding a text line and a web chat version to our hotline because we had a lot of survivors who obviously could not contact us while they're co-quarantined with an abuser. They didn't feel safe making a phone call or asking for help, especially our immigrant survivors who are limited English proficient. It's been a lot of readjustment to our services, but our numbers have been increasing over this time because of the rise in domestic violence. I know I've seen an increase of at least over 30% for many of the months during this quarantine. Some of the special barriers that immigrants do experience when they are trying to seek help. So to get back to where I was before this whole debacle happened, including race in this conversation is incredibly important. There are several things that we do know: that Black women are 3 times more likely to be killed by an intimate partner, and pregnant Black women are 11 times more likely to be killed by an intimate partner than pregnant white women. They are also more likely to have their symptoms overlooked or ignored by responding law enforcement and or medical personnel. When it comes to addressing the Latina population, we find that nearly 48% of Latinas in at least one study reported that their partner's violence against them increased after they immigrated to the United States, but that they were extremely fearful in reporting this because, as we've seen, there's been heightened anti-immigrant and xenophobic rhetoric that has had a really profound effect on these women feeling safe in reporting this abuse. We have seen a huge decrease in immigrant survivors that are seeking things like U visas and T visas that are designed to protect them from things like domestic violence and human trafficking. And that is because there has been so much confusion around a huge variety of immigrant rights as of late. So we've seen enormous changes to things like asylum laws, to public charge laws, to changes with visas, to DACA protections. We also know that most of our immigrant survivors were not able to access the benefits in the CARES Act that was passed by Congress. So obviously, if you're an undocumented immigrant, you weren't able to get any access to the checks that were sent out and or the employment benefits, because many of our immigrant survivors who are undocumented obviously work under the table or work in very unsafe conditions, but don't feel that they can report these things to their bosses. We've seen a huge increase in COVID-19 spread in our immigrant populations too, because of several factors. So only 16% of Latinos nationally have reported that they can work from home. So the majority of them don't have the option of working from home and have been continually going to work and not having proper protections against things like COVID-19. Our Black and Latino immigrants also are experiencing varying levels of oppression completely outside of just their immigration status. So Black and Latino communities are more concentrated often in low-paying, semi-skilled occupations than the overall workforce. So these survivors are already at a disadvantage when they're seeking assistance because they have limited financial resources that create substantial barriers. So they don't have time to go to court to pursue charges against their abuser because they can't get time off work, they don't have paid leave, they maybe don't have safe housing or reliable transportation, they don't have affordable childcare so that someone can care for their children while they're attending court dates. So you see how the intersection of like class, race, and immigration create an enormous variety of barriers that are really difficult. We also see, obviously, LGBTQ people of color experience the highest rates of physical violence in their communities. And our LGBTQ survivors, who are also immigrants, are dealing with so many different factors, including that they're facing homophobia in the legal and medical system. They're facing transphobia in shelters. There's the potential of them being outed by even reporting this. So if they don't feel safe in their community and they are trying to seek protections from a same-sex partner, it is really difficult for them to navigate that. And there's also obviously lots of legal issues, including a lack of equal access to housing, employment, medical rights. Another population that I often work with is Native women, and they have the highest rates of domestic violence of any minority community, but are more likely to live in poverty, and to have differing access to rights depending on if they live on a reservation, if the person who's abusing them is either Native or non-Native. And there's also a historical and societal oppression that compounds these issues. Native women often have a deep mistrust for white agencies and service providers, and that has a very long history in this country. So I want to start with us just thinking about how race and class and economics coincide with immigration and how it compounds all of these barriers. Something that we have to talk about too is culture. So what is culture, right? It's a set of values, structures, and practices that are held in common by a group of people. And it's often identified by ancestry, language, tradition, and it can describe those characteristics that we're born with, some of which we see as permanent and some of which we see as fluid or changeable. So on top of all these other factors we're talking about, we have this huge umbrella of what we call culture. So with all of my immigrant survivors, I have to be incredibly mindful of all the factors that come with that. So with culture comes race, ethnicity, national origin, sexual orientation, immigration status, access to education, rural versus urban divides, age, class, religion, and all of these things coincide and are very important to think about when working with immigrant survivors, because you have to have cultural humility in order to work with immigrant survivors. You cannot make assumptions that what works for you or what works for someone else is going to work for this person in particular. I also see a lot of issues with just communication and working with immigrant survivors. I do an entire training on how to work with interpreters, because it is a skill set that a lot of people may not have, because it's something you have to become familiar with. Working with interpreters has an entire array of difficulties, because you are having to think about your tone, your body language. You're having to control the conversation via the interpreter. And you also run that risk of having an interpreter who's not particularly qualified. So I can't tell you how many times I have seen law enforcement or medical personnel use a family member as an interpreter. That is not best practices. I think it should be pretty obvious that if you're responding to a domestic violence scene, that having the children serve as interpreters is incredibly damaging and traumatizing to them, and that often the abuser has a higher fluency in the English language. So oftentimes the female survivor is the one who's being extremely isolated, not allowed to work outside the home, and with limited resources that allow her to adjust to this new community once immigrating here. And oftentimes the abuser is the one who's working outside the home and therefore is maintaining a higher fluency in the English language. So they often attempt to explain away what's happening in the home and try to stop an actual interpreter from ever really being included in the conversation, because they are speaking for the survivor to protect themselves. So we've also had issues where even in testimony in court, when trying to prosecute an abuser, we've had interpreters that were not properly trained and who have intersected their own opinion during the testimony of a witness. We had a survivor who was testifying to an extreme case of domestic violence. And in the middle of her testimony, something shifted in her face and her demeanor completely. And she completely withdrew within herself. And everyone was trying to figure out, what just happened? What's happening here? And she started to not answer a lot of the questions or refuse to give more information during the testimony. We ended up finding out later that during interpreting, the interpreter turned to her and said in their native language, which no one else understood in the courtroom, said to her, if you hadn't dressed like such a slut, this probably wouldn't have happened to you. I have seen so many instances where there is victim shaming involved immediately when working with interpreters and or with other professionals in the field. So we also have to understand that we are working with so many professionals that come in with their own biases and assumptions. And that makes this process terrifying for immigrant survivors who are being asked to, I always say to people, how scared would you be to testify in a court of law in a different country where you do not speak the language? Most Americans are terrified of testifying in court. We have to do so much work to get our American English speaking survivors to show up to court and testify. Imagine how terrifying that is when you're a survivor and when you have judges or magistrates or lawyers who are not specialized in domestic violence, who victim blame, who shame you for what you've been through. It's a very difficult process. We know that there are a lot of specific barriers that immigrants face as well. So immigration status is used as a tactic of abuse. I have so many survivors who have their immigration status held over their heads when it comes to their abusers. And they don't know that things like a U visa exists for survivors of domestic violence, or a VAWA self-petition if you are undocumented but your partner is an American citizen. They're told a lot of incorrect information about their own immigration status and may believe that if they report this, they'll be deported or they'll have their children taken from them. Fear of deportation is enormous. We serve everyone. Your immigration status does not matter and should never matter when it comes to issues of abuse. But obviously, when we experience so much anti-immigrant and xenophobic rhetoric, people are terrified of being deported if they report a crime. So this is something we're continually dealing with, and we're having to do a lot of really specialized outreach in these communities to make sure that they understand that they are safe with us and that their immigration status will never be used against them. Isolation and lack of support systems. So we see the most extreme forms of isolation with our immigrant survivors, especially if they were brought here by their abuser. Isolation is one of the strongest tactics that abusers use. A lot are able to report what's happening to them. They're not able to have a support system. They often are far away from their own family and friends. And that's also a tactic that's used by abusers of all kinds, is removing you from your family and friends. I have so many survivors here who were brought here by their abuser, whether they are an American citizen or an immigrant, and are completely isolated with no family or friends in a new city and experiencing a really heightened level of abuse. I also frequently see threats to family members in their country of origin. So I have had survivors where, and there are many countries where marriage as a union is also seen as a form of transaction. There's money that may be involved in the marriage transaction. There's property, land, all of these things can be involved in this. So often I have seen threats against the survivor's family member if the survivor reports this or if the survivor leaves the abuser. I just had a client from Nepal whose abuser was saying that he would harm his family back in Nepal, would harm her family if she left him, that they would be destitute, that they would be left with nothing, that they would be seen as a disgrace and a humiliation in their community. Obviously, these are terrifying factors because it's no longer just about you, it's about your family now. And that really hits a different way with survivors. We obviously are also seeing that there's an increased lack of trust in government agencies or law enforcement. There's been increased ICE enforcement, obviously, in recent days. We've seen ICE raids happening in specific communities here where we know there's a high population of immigrants. We have a very large Guatemalan population here, and they are not Spanish speaking. They actually speak Mayan languages. So Mam or Quiche are the two languages that we typically see with them. But we have seen certain neighborhoods get raided over and over again by ICE. And people are terrified to report anything because they don't want that spotlight and that attention put on them or anyone else in their community. People have been afraid during COVID-19 to go to hospitals because while ICE has said that they will not engage in activities around hospitals and or medical centers during COVID-19, that's not trusted information, right? So we see people that are terrified and are not seeking medical help or not seeking legal help because they're afraid of getting picked up by ICE and being deported back to their home countries. There's also factors of coercive reproduction that we see quite often. A lot of our immigrant survivors are experiencing reproductive coercion, may not even have ever had proper reproductive education back in their home country and had never had access to things like contraception. So we see reproductive coercion very often, and that also leads to these different health disparities. We see that our immigrant survivors, when they're trying to go to critical appointments, they often have the abuser there with them who tries to serve as the mouthpiece and the interpreter during these things. So they don't want their partner to be accessing certain things like reproductive care or contraceptive care. So these are barriers that we see all the time in these communities. I think that the most important thing to remember is that every single culture has distinct differences, and people who come from a culture that you see as a monolith, there are so many differences in these cultures. So I will often say, someone will say, I work with Latino or Latina survivors, and that changes consistently dependent upon geography and language. Survivors that I serve who are from Guatemala or Mexico have completely different cultures and needs and language barriers than survivors that I serve that are from Puerto Rico. So I think it's important to not see these things as monolithic and to really try to stay away from dangerous language that kind of encourages that otherization, or tries to see other cultures as inherently more violent or more misogynistic. I think something that we see people talk about with people, say, from the Middle East, we talk about honor killings being a thing. We in the States have an incredible epidemic of domestic violence, right? Who are we to talk about another culture being more violent? Your chances, if you are a survivor of being killed by your intimate partner, is higher than almost any other health disparity that we can speak of. So I think it's very important to stay away from language that talks about other cultures as if there's an epidemic of violence there and that it is unique to that culture, because sexism, racism, homophobia, ableism, all of these things just appear different. They appear differently in different cultures and they're emphasized in different ways. So I think the most important thing that you can do is be respectful, listen, be someone who validates their experience, try to link them with other people that they recognize and identify with. We have a lot of really strong links in our community with different organizations, whether it's SUCASA, or Asian Community Alliance or the Islamic Center. So we are very serious about trying to give someone the support that they need in a way that is culturally competent and that honors their culture and that allows the agency of the survivor to be at the center of these services. Every survivor is an expert in their own life. Okay, you were the expert in your own life. I'm the expert in my own life. It is important that their agency is always at the center. It is their choice, what they're ready for, and what they are willing to do when they are experiencing this. I think that we just have to remember that this is going to culturally look very different. People are going to have different ideas about what relationships look like, what gender roles are, child rearing. These are all very different in different cultures. And I think it's important to maintain a respect in that situation and allow people to make their own decisions about their own lives. Because one of the most important things that you can remember is that survivors are continually having their decision-making ability and their agency stolen from them. We do not want to engage in abusive tactics like that. We don't want to encourage that kind of trauma response. We don't want to further traumatize them. So making sure that they are the center of their experience and that you are specifically tailoring your work around them is incredibly important. And if you need help, reach out for help. There are plenty of opportunities to connect with these communities and to connect with them on the ground, because I think that's something that we often see too, especially in agencies that have long-term had white leadership, is that you tend to insert yourself into another community and tell them what they need, right? We have no right to tell anybody else what they need or what works for them. We're supposed to be allies, and we're supposed to listen to what they need and help to give them the resources that they need in order to strengthen their communities so that they are safer and happier and healthier. So my biggest takeaway here is to treat everyone individually, to not go in with any assumptions about someone's life because of the certain culture or nation of origin that they come from, and to be an ally and to affirm them, because at the end of the day, most of my survivors say that they can't even think of someone who has fully supported them in this experience or even said that they believe them. So some of the smallest things like that, just saying, I believe you, I'm here for you, I support you, I'm listening, are some of the most powerful things that you can do for these survivors. I don't want to go over time, and I know that tech was an issue at the jump. So I know you guys maybe want to do a Q&A, or if anyone does have questions, I'm here to answer.
I certainly have at least one question for you. I had a few prepared, but you've been so comprehensive with your presentation that you've covered a lot of them. So I want to give people, I'm going to say a few things here and want to give people a few seconds. If you've got any questions specifically about either Danielle's work or maybe more generally about the intersections of immigration and domestic violence, please go ahead and put that in the chat or the Q&A. While you're doing that, I'm going to direct people to our website. As some of you who joined the last session know, this is not just an information about event about information and advocacy. It's also a fundraiser to support our services here at YWCA Dayton. And so as many organizations, we've been hit hard by COVID-19, having to cancel, or in this case, change events. The way funding is coming down is changed dramatically. And so please, 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 if you're able to support our work here at YWCA Dayton, you can follow that link and make a donation. My question for you, Danielle, you know, a lot of folks who maybe don't spend a lot of time around domestic violence, you know, ask questions like, well, why didn't she leave? And they're just unable to comprehend some of the kind of the more baseline misunderstandings, let alone the complexities when we talk about layering immigration, race, class, religion, and everything that comes with that. And so that, you know, the work of this event is to really dig into the nuance and the intersections. And I think you're not alone as a presenter today in not just talking about your intersection, but all of the other things that intersect with immigration. And so I guess my question for you is, do you have it for those who are watching this morning, are there any resources, videos, books? Certainly, if you're in Dayton, you can connect with us at YWCA Dayton. If you're in Cincinnati, connect with YWCA Cincinnati. But for those who might want to do some learning on their own or some research, do you have any resources that you would point them to? And then you can mention it and I'll get them from you and we'll send it out in an email after the fact as well.
Sure. God, there's so many opportunities to learn about this. I mean, even basic understandings of trauma, looking at things like the book, The Body Keeps the Score and stuff like that. I think that a lot of people have difficulty understanding how long-term trauma affects how adult survivors address abuse, right? And we see more and more. I would really encourage everyone to look at something like the ACEs study too, so that you understand adverse childhood experiences and how they are a direct correlation to adult behaviors and adult abuse. I think it's really important for people to understand that the earlier the intervention, the better. Like we should be if you can look up resources on safe and healthy relationships with kids, right? Like there's so many conversations that we should be having earlier that would offset things that happen to someone later in life, because we're finding that a lot of survivors are hesitant to access certain systems fully because of long-term trauma responses that they have. Because often I struggle to think of more than a handful of survivors who didn't have consecutive traumas in childhood that are directly affecting them now. So the ACEs studies, Body Keeps the Score, I have like entire lists of things I can send you if you want me to send you some resources. I know that everybody learns differently. So I can send entire resources about that. And I think it's also important to recognize that it takes the average survivor 7 times to leave their abuser. When you are interacting with someone, they could be at time 1 or time 7. It is a very different survivor you're interacting with along that entire continuum. So I think it's really important to emphasize patience, that nothing is simple. Telling a survivor she should leave someone when she has no access to the mutual funds with her abuser, she doesn't have her own credit card, she has 5 children, she has never been allowed to work, she doesn't have her own car or transportation. It's an incredibly condescending thing to tell somebody, like, you know, you really should be doing better at leaving this person. The entire point of abuse is full power and control over another human being. And we have to understand the layering of that and how it is intentional that it makes it impossible to leave, right? So I really encourage you to have conversations with those around you. I really encourage you to understand that you know someone, and you definitely know several people who are experiencing domestic violence, either right now or have before. You are currently working with someone who has experienced domestic violence or is currently experiencing it right now. There are so many conversations that you could be having, learning from these people, but in order to do that, you have to establish trust, and they have to know that you're a safe space for them. So educating yourself first is the most powerful thing you can do in offering support for survivors of violence.
Excellent. Well, we would certainly welcome your resource list, and for all you who are watching, we will send that out as soon as we get it from Danielle. Danielle, thank you so much. Technical glitches aside, this has been incredibly informative, and you're a wealth of knowledge, and we appreciate that. I want to just share one last thing here. If you are on this session or you're rewatching this session in the future and you need support or help, please don't hesitate to call 937-222-SAFE. That is the hotline here at YWCA Dayton, or look up a hotline in your area. Obviously, we don't know all of them depending on where you're coming from, but certainly there are resources available, and we want to make sure that there's a coordinated effort to support you. And then if you are a community member, an organizational leader, whatever role you might play, and you want to get better connected with the YW or resources in this community, please don't hesitate to reach out to us at info@ywcadayton.org. And then one last reminder, we've had some really generous folks hopping on and making donations. Your contributions go a long way to ensuring that survivors and their children in this community get all of the resources they need. So please don't hesitate to go to ywcadayton.org/VAV, Voices Against Violence, donate. ywcadayton.org/VAV, donate. Danielle, thank you again so much. We really appreciate all the ways that you are coming around us to support. Thanks to Larson's Lions and Alhamdani for sponsoring this session, and to Regal Financial for sponsoring this entire event. Our next session is at 11. We have Dr. Ludi Green joining us from Washington, D.C. to talk about the intersections of domestic violence and employment. We hope you all can join us then. And until then, thanks and see you soon.